Protests in Iran are getting worse. In fact, the unrest can be seen in over 100 cities in that country. To talk more about it is our foreign affairs expert, Lisa Daftari, joining me once again via Skype from Los Angeles. Lisa, a lot of the protests are in reaction to a 300% increase in gasoline prices. Some protesters have allegedly been killed.
Yes, it's an awful round of protests, and we hear about protests pretty often in Iran. This one is pretty serious, probably dating back to about 2009 when we had the Green Revolution in Iran. That was probably when you had the previous most significant round of protests, and that was over a fraudulent election. Now we talk about the price of gasoline going up, and you know, that's an excuse, right? So it starts out because of one item, and the last time they had protests there was because of the price of eggs. So you can ascertain from this that the life is not easy under this regime, and the sanctions placed by the U.S. and the West doesn't help, because the government passes on that economic burden onto the people. So once they come out, it's no longer about the gasoline or the price of eggs or a fraudulent election. It becomes about 40 years of living under a repressive regime that doesn't believe in human rights, that doesn't believe in giving women rights, that doesn't believe in allowing protesters to voice their opinions, because after all, the internet has been cut off. And you have the leaders of the country, these mullahs, going on social media to express themselves, but yet they don't give the people of Iran that same right. And why? Because they know that that's how the people have, they become citizen journalists, and they tell their story to the world. They also use the internet and social media to organize and to plan more and more protests. So this is the Achilles heel of the government. We've always said that, and I appreciate you covering this, Hal, because I've been watching cable news all day, and over the last, 10 hours, I think it was reported once on Fox News on one show, not even the other shows. So this is not being reported. I think, we kind of look past these happenings in the Middle East, but this is a major, major happening, and who knows what this will bring. I mean, has this happened before in Iran with a false alarm? Yes, but could this be a potential game changer for the region? Absolutely.
The Supreme Leaders even hinted at a crackdown. What would that look like?
Very bloody, very, very bloody. The last few times that we had protests in Iran, there weren't that many casualties, and we kind of thought that the government was going a bit, not soft, because that's not the right word, but they weren't cracking down to their full potential or being as brutal as they could be or have been in the past. But that was because potentially they were trying to show a milder side, if that's even possible, to the West. But now they have nothing to prove to anyone. They have no reason to play nicely when the West is pulled out of the nuclear deal. So now it's anything goes. They're going to protect themselves and their hegemonic rule in the region, at home. And again, this has always been the weakness of the regime. They go out there, they're in Lebanon supporting Hezbollah, they're in Yemen, they're in Iraq, they're in Gaza. But back at home, they know that they have so many, the percentage of disenchanted Iranians out of the 80 million population is extremely high. It's extremely high. And if they're going to start cracking down, they will do so in order to protect their reign and this government's longevity.
Not too far away in Iraq, an Iraqi protester was killed amid fresh clashes on a Baghdad bridge. Tell me more about that.
Yes, and now this is related. Part of the disenchantment of the people in Iraq is for them to come out onto the streets and want to shake off the influence of the Iranian rule on them. The regime in Iran has stuck its nose into Iraqi politics. They always have. Whenever they find a political vacuum or an opportunity, they swoop right in, and that's exactly what they did. When the U.S. pulled out, when this vacuum became available, the Iranian regime swooped right in, and they created an opportunity for themselves, again, wanting to expand their tentacles and expand their influence in the region. I've always said the original Islamic State was the government of Iran that took over after the Shah was toppled 40 years ago. These mullahs wanted to create the first Islamic State, which was a Shiite Islamic State. ISIS, as we know it, the other Islamic State, is a Sunni Islamic State. So you have to understand the intentions of the Iranian government here, and that is trickled into protests in Iraq. The Iraqis want a better life. They have had the worst of turmoil over the last more than 2 decades, and now they want better. And in shaking off this foreign intervention is part of that.
Now, speaking of protests, Lisa, police in Hong Kong are now threatening to use live ammunition on democracy protesters. Does the government not believe that tear gas is enough?
Yeah, Tal, I don't know if you've seen some of the pictures coming out, or the video coming out of these protests in Hong Kong, the fire that was set at the university, and now, as you said, the government going hard. We've seen on both sides restraint so far. There have been one or two casualties here and there, but now it looks like the protesters have stepped up their game, and in reaction to that, the government has stepped up their game. They've become extremely brutal in the crackdowns, and as you said, it's no longer about tear gas. This is about firing on the protesters to stop the protesters, to intimidate other protesters from coming out. And more, we're seeing little, do-it-yourself postcards and videos online instructing the protesters on how to protect themselves, how to create, do it yourself, or make it at home kind of face masks, to come out and wear certain garb to protect themselves and their identities, because this is their reality. If they're going to come out, they are on the 1 yard line in what they believe is in getting their message out and getting what they came out onto the streets for. And because of that, they're not going to back down anytime soon. So again, it's going to get worse before it gets any better on Hong Kong. We're just hoping for that it doesn't get too bloody and we don't see a high number of casualties there.
China has sailed its carrier fleet through the Taiwan Strait in an apparent message days after a U.S. warship crossed, Lisa.
Yeah, very funny for two countries that are trying to work out a deal, right? Flexing their muscles, this one and that one. So the Chinese, they're still playing their game of, again, thumping their chests and creating, or maintaining, I should say, their visibility and their presence in the region, particularly when it comes to countries like Taiwan and Japan and the Koreas, and wanting that their many years of reign on that territory maintains itself. And the U.S., whatever deal they have up in the air, whatever punitive measures that they're paying for economically, well, they're gonna brunt that, and they're going to go forward and want to continue, again, flexing their muscles. They're not backing down anytime soon. So I don't know how this is going to work with the two countries hoping to come to some sort of resolution.
Yeah, they're talking about a phase one of a trade deal between China and the United States. What does that actually look like, though?
Yeah, it's hard to tell because we've come down this road before, right, Hal? They've agreed and then they've backed down. So, in terms of what this will look like economically, well, I can tell you from our point of view here in the United States, every time there's even a little glimmer of hope that there will be some deal between these two countries, the markets soar. And every time that there is some sort of we kind of are not going in that direction, you see that the markets tank. So we play seesaw on our stock markets just based on that optimism or pessimism that comes from this deal. So imagine that this will have a very, very important, significant outcome for both nations with regards to the economy, with regards to optimism. Here in the United States, it will affect our election, I'm sure of that. And whether or not that Donald Trump is saving that wild card as we get closer to the election to announce some sort of magical deal with the Chinese, who knows? But again, it will be quite significant. A phase one probably looks like just coming to the table and announcing some sort of optimism to move forward. Nothing else has been announced, no details. But again, the points that they can't agree on, who knows if either side will concede those points, but it will have more to do with copyright infringement, with the Chinese having to agree to not cheat and not go behind the backs of the West, and in terms of patents and in terms of technology, and we know they have a very hard time doing that and agreeing to that.
A top department store in Paris was shut down thanks to the French Yellow Vest movement, Lisa.
Yes, this is an interesting news because we haven't heard from the Yellow Vests protesters in a while. I was in Paris in the end of May, early June, and I remember on random Saturday, you see police on every corner, and they say, well, the Yellow Vest protesters are out again. it looks like a bunch of young people out onto the streets, and they do cause a lot of violence. They break glass, they go into these stores, and the department store that they actually shut down was the Galeries Lafayette, which anybody who's been to Paris has probably frequented. It's a beautiful, beautiful kind of a it's like a museum more than a department store. It's beautiful, and they know the significance of that, both in terms of tourism and the economy, and in terms of just representing what Paris and what France is. So they know what they're doing. They're trying to make themselves known and their voices heard, but the violence that they cause, the intimidation that they cause, they put the police out. They're very disrespectful. I don't know if this is the right way to get their message across, but it continues, and I think it's just every weekend or every other weekend or so.
U.S. and South Korea have postponed a joint military drill as an act of goodwill towards North Korea, but here's the catch. North Korea's Kim Jong-un supervised air drills of his own, while the U.S. and South Korea postponed their drills, Lisa.
Yes, very, very interesting development coming out of North Korea. And why are we trying to show a sign of good faith to the North Koreans? Who knows? While they're going on with their own agenda. Again, you have China up in the air, you have North Korea up in the air. I mean, here in the United States, we have our own kangaroo court system going on with the attempts to impeach President Trump, and meanwhile you have the rest of the world is wreaking havoc. And I only say that because I always wonder, maybe this is my journalistic mind, but or because I look at the world from the foreign policy point of view, but you always wonder, what does it look like from the outside? And the only reason I say that is because when you look at the world leader in the United States trying to rip and repair the rest of the world with regards to foreign policy, and they can't get their own act together, well, it's time to flex your muscles and make yourselves known. This is the time for these countries to kind of get ahead, so to speak, when it looks like there isn't any order here in the West. And again, it looks awful, and you have the North Koreans going forward with how many drills have we had? Almost weekly, we talk about this, Hal, about how they've gone forward and they've done something that appears to be not in the spirit of talks moving forward with the United States, but yet again, we try to bring them to the negotiating table. It wasn't just that historic first meeting with Donald Trump. I think Donald Trump actually wants to get something done with them. It was already a milestone, and hopefully it will be even a more significant one if he can get the North Koreans back to the negotiating table sometime soon.
A recent report from the BBC says 32 militants were killed in a Burkina Faso slave raid, sex slave trade raid. The army in the West African nation refers to the militants as terrorists.
Yes, we don't talk much about the ongoing, and I would say even growth of terrorism in the African continent. This is something that's been ongoing for years and years. And what's their MO? To round up children, and especially young girls, and take them into sex slavery. We had a huge story about 4 or 5 years ago. The girls from Boko Haram, they were released for the most part, but you have many, many more cells of insurgents and terrorists that grow, and again, they use the same MO. And why is that? Because they know how valuable that virginity is, how valuable that femininity is, and how families protect and love their daughters, and that's their vulnerability. So they will seize upon that, and it's so sad to see that this is still going on in the world. And you have feminists here in the West that lobby for such frivolous things in comparison, and yet they don't use their voices or their platforms to ever make any sort of comment or call for the release or actually underscores some of these very, very important and tragic stories that are going on around the world. So it's a good thing to do, to remember. And thank you again, Hal, for bringing, highlighting these very important stories that aren't told anywhere else.
Oh, absolutely, you bet. Protests continue in Bolivia amid a real food and gas shortage in the South American nation, Lisa.
Right. So how many nations so far? We've talked about where the protests are going on, Bolivia being one of them. We talked about this last week, where we have a young woman who is a mayor taking over, and there will be and continues to be protests, and a very, very tumultuous exchange of power here. All over South America, you have this concept, and it comes from decades and decades of having the same system, the same fraudulent systems in many cases, where people believe that the government's stealing, the people aren't getting enough. They've grown. I mean, you can blame this on the internet, you can blame this on globalization, you can blame this on many, many things, but people are growing, people are becoming cognizant of their realities, and they're going out onto the streets. And they're going out onto the streets to gain a better future, a better life, to petition for what they believe and what they want, a better life. And Bolivia is one of those. So again, they're watching their neighbors in Venezuela, and in Brazil. There were protests over the weekend that wasn't reported anywhere. But again, this is more of that rip and repair. What are we going to see going towards the future? And people are again vying for something better for themselves and for their children.
A former Nazi guard faces more than 5,200 counts of accessory to murder. Tell me more about that.
Is an interesting story, and I say interesting because this is such a part of history. At the same time where you have people denying the Holocaust, actually living and showing us that they don't believe in something that happened, you have people who like this, men in their 90s, who were instrumental to killing hundreds and thousands of people, adding up to the 6 million who were killed in gas chambers and, shot at point blank range. And, it's so interesting, again, to see that this part of history still lives on, and a man in his 90s sits there in his wheelchair, being charged with these multiple murders. This will be one of the last cases we see, because again, they're dying off or they're already deceased. But it's very interesting to see that they still exist. Their stories have to be told. These stories have to be highlighted in order to tell this part of history, particularly, as I said, when people are denying this part of history, so that it should never happen again. It should never be repeated.
Our foreign affairs expert, Lisa Daftari, joining me once again from Los Angeles. Thank you, Lisa.
My pleasure.
On behalf of all of us here at BCN, I'm Hal Roberts. God bless, and thanks so much for watching.